Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and information to get you teeth into concerning the Ukraine War. I'm going to give you a little insight into cyber warfare and the threat of that um, method of creating disruption and doing damage to, in this case, an enemy. Uh, we often think about missiles hitting energy infrastructure like a power station, and what's the intention there? Well, it's to disrupt power supply so the people of, say, Ukraine don't have power. But of course, this can be achieved with cyber warfare, and it can be a lot cheaper and arguably a lot easier. So you could send an attack into energy infrastructure, take down their you know f- website or intranet or whatever their functionality, and take it out. So the same effect is brought about, i.e., without having to blow stuff up, the public don't get their electricity, for example. So we mustn't think of this kind of fifth generation warfare as just about kind of information spaces. Perhaps you know there are really strong parallels between conventional warfare and this kind of warfare, in what its intentions are and what it looks like when it succeeds. So fifth generation warfare being about sort of information space, hearts and minds, as part. You're fighting over narratives, so on and so forth. So this is a Google, uh, basically a blog piece, but a sort of report on how they see the cyber situation. The fog of war: how the Ukraine conflict transformed the cyber threat landscape. And 1 year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Google TAG, together with additional research from Mandiant and Trust and Safety, provide insights into changes in the cyber threat landscape triggered by the war. And this report makes some interesting reading, or this article. I'm just going to pick out some pertinent points. So, since the war began, governments, companies, civil society groups, and countless others have been working around the clock to support the Ukrainian people and their institutions. At Google, we support these efforts and continue to announce new commitments and support to Ukraine. This includes a donation of 50,000 Google Workspace licenses for the government, rapid air raid alerts system for Android phones in the region, support for refugees, businesses, and entrepreneurs, and measures to indefinitely pause monetization and limit the reach of Russian state news media. So, actually, Google are playing a really important part in the defense of Ukraine and in constricting Russia from being able to do a whole bunch of stuff. So, you can imagine when the US, when the EU, when countries say, right, we're going to sanction Russia, and that's going to, they're going to stop being able to sell these sort of things. There's going to be a massive, massive IT component in that, in how we monitor how that happens, how we enforce particular rules and sanctions we set out. There's a huge amount of work that has to be done by companies like Google. Um, One of the most pressing challenges, the piece says, however, is that the Ukrainian government is under near constant digital attack. Shortly after the invasion, we expanded eligibility for Project Shield, our free protection against distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS, so that Ukrainian government websites and embassies worldwide could stay online and continue to offer critical services. So, what a DDoS? So, the way I understand it from memory is that basically you have a website or an intranet or whatever, and it gets hit if it's able to be hit. Intranets might be behind protections or whatever, but a general website, I if it it's okay. It's built to withstand a certain amount of traffic, but if that traffic suddenly is phenomenal, so you're getting all these automated hits from these kind of bots, if you like, literally like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hits all at once, then basically the website just crumbles and breaks down, and you therefore have no functionality. So, in other words, you can bring down services, you can bring down infrastructure services such as energy, such as whatever government services, pensions, whatever, and you can do serious damage to, in this case, Ukraine, by things like DDoS attacks. Now, DDoS attacks are, um, they've been going on for some time. They're pretty prevalent, and they often hit the news. Uh, they so what just to say. we continue to provide direct assistance to the Ukrainian government and critical infrastructure entities under the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative, including compromise assessments, incident response services, shared cyber threat intelligence, and security transformation services to help detect, mitigate, and defend against cyber attacks. In addition, we continue to implement protections for users and track and disrupt cyber threats to help raise awareness among the security community and high risk users and maintain information quality. So actually, Google arguably are doing a really important job here. They have a really important role to play. So in their kind of work that they've done over the year with their collaborators as well, they've three key findings. So firstly, the Russian government-backed attackers have engaged in an aggressive, multi-pronged effort, to gain a decisive wartime advantage in cyberspace, often with mixed results. So this was predicted. This kind of multi-pronged aggressive attack in the cyberspace was predicted. Everyone thought Russia would do this, but it has had mixed results. In fact, I've reported before. I've my opinion has been it's been very underwhelming. The question is, has the cyber threat been or not just threat, has the effects of their cyber warfare been underwhelming because of a lack of Russia uh, doing a good job at that? Or has it been underwhelming because the defenses have been so good? So when you've got people like Google on your side doing stuff like this, when you've got loads of competent IT people coming to help out Ukraine and the rest of the world to defend against Russia in this sphere, is it an underwhelming cyber warfare campaign because of that defense being so good? And so you don't hear about it in the news. So you think, oh, Russia have been a bit rubbish there. But actually, no, everyone else has been really good. Or have indeed Russia been a bit underwhelming? Now, you've got to remember that since the beginning of the war and particularly after mobilization, you had a brain drain of Russian expertise in particularly the IT uh, you know, sector. So you would have had uh, an awful lot of people who Russia would have loved to have put to this kind of campaign, put to good use in cyber warfare, who are just aren't there. They aren't in the country, and that could have had a really significant effect here. Um, so there's lots to be said, but I go on to say from its incident response work, Mandiant observed more destructive cyber attacks in Ukraine during the first 4 months of 2022 than in the previous 8 years, with attacks peaking around the start of the invasion. While they saw significant activity after that period, the pace of attacks slowed and appeared less coordinated than the initial wave in February 2022. So here, really, there was Russia hadn't been able to keep up that high level of attacks that was seen at the beginning of the campaign. Again, why is that? For the reasons I've given. Um, Obviously, you know, if even if the defense had been really good, if there was that potential to attack, then they would have kept that attack up. So I think, if anything, that may represent a lack of capacity to keep doing that. I mean, when you think, the whole world, it wasn't just Ukraine that was expecting cyber warfare from Russia, but actually, it takes a lot of people and resources to do stuff and expertise to do stuff like that. You can't just go, oh, yeah, Russia are going to do this and expect it to happen, because they've got like apartment blocks full of bots and whatnot. There's still required those apartment blocks to be filled. And if you've had a brain drain and if you've got, you know, people being mobilized, literally taken to war, some of those people might have been, I know that they kind of, there's special, um, you can opt out of mobilization if you have special skills and expertise and whatnot that the Kremlin are seeking. Then possibly not. But you can imagine that actually Russia really haven't had the capacity to wage this cyber war on a huge international scale that everyone was expecting. Um, Specifically, destructive attacks often occurred more quickly after the attacker gained or regained access, often through compromised edge infrastructure. Many operations indicated an attempt by the Russian Armed Forces Main Directorate of the General Staff, the GRU, to balance competing priorities of access, collection, and disruption through each phase of activity, whatever that means. That's probably why I didn't highlight that, because that's word salad. Um, So the second point here, Moscow has leveraged the full spectrum IO, that's information operations, from overt state-backed media to covert platforms and accounts to shape public perception of the war. And it says there are these operations have three goals. One, to undermine the Ukrainian government. Two, to fracture international support for Ukraine. And three, to maintain domestic support for Russia in Russia for the war. So those are attack everyone else, attack Ukraine, uh, and keep ourselves unified and keep the narrative strong within Russia. Um, and Google disrupted over 1,950 instances of Russian IO activity on their platforms in 2022, and then they worked aggressively across products and any activity that disrupted their own policies. So they could definitely say, because it's quite difficult for a company like this if they're going to go after Russia and Russia say, "Hang on, you're targeting us," and blah blah blah. So it has to be like you are breaking the policies that we have put in place, and they try and circumvent those policies. But that's how they can be seen. Google here to be supporting Ukraine. It's just upholding the rules they've got in place. So they go on to say the covert Russian IO information operations we've disrupted on Google product services primarily focused on maintaining Russian domestic support for the war in Ukraine, with over 90% of the instances in the Russian language. So this might be overwhelmingly in Russia, although other Russian-speaking countries, like indeed Ukraine. But they are most of the activities that Google have been involved in here have been concerning uh, disinformation. It seems in trying to give a Russian narrative to their own people. So, and that is, they will have Google will have strong policies on disinformation, facts and all this, and all sorts of other aspects of the information operations that take place, domestically for Russia. So that's interesting. Third point is the invasion has triggered a notable shift in the Eastern European cybercriminal ecosystem that will likely have long-term implications for both coordination between criminal groups and the scale of cyber crime worldwide. And this is something I'll be talking about in a second by bringing into play a contributor to Ukraine the Latest podcast. So some groups have split over political allegiances and geopolitics, and this is because a lot of cybercrime and criminal gangs have been based actually in Ukraine prior to the war, and in Russia, and in places around that kind of neck of the woods. So some people have split over political allegiances and geopolitics, while others have lost prominent operators, which will impact the way we think about these groups and our traditional understanding of their capabilities. We've also seen a trend towards specialization in the ransomware ecosystem that blends tactics across actors, making definitive attribution more difficult. In other words, we don't know who's doing it. The war in Ukraine has also been defined by what we expected but didn't see. For example, we didn't observe a surge of attacks against critical infrastructure outside of Ukraine. So that's what I was saying earlier. This warfare really has been restricted primarily to Ukraine, and that's been quite surprising. Again, it almost certainly says something about their Russian capacity. And then it goes on to talk about sort of ransomware and Trojans and all sorts, and then sort of finishes up. But that this kind of idea of cyber criminality, ransomware and whatnot, is a good time to bring in Gareth Caulfield, who's a senior technology reporter for. Here he's speaking to the team at Ukraine the Latest, the Daily Telegraph podcast. So over to him.
Prior to the war, there was an awful lot of cross-border stuff going on between Ukraine and Russia when it came to ransomware gangs. Now, a lot of ransomware activity is concentrated in what you might describe as Russian-speaking nations. And it was known that there were, and indeed still are to this day, ransomware criminals operating from within Ukraine and from within Russia, and were even members of the same gangs, and were actually sort of working side by side, cheek by jowl on their widespread extortion campaigns directed against the West. And what happened when war broke out was extremely interesting, certainly to the cybersecurity industry, because in one high-profile case, there was a gang called Conti, who have been involved in extorting hundreds of millions from Western businesses. And a Conti member from Ukraine once the invasion, once the Russian tanks had rolled across the border, said, "Look, I'm not going to put up with this. This is an outrage. Even by my standards, this is an outrage." And he took all of the internal chats and communications from the gang and he dumped them all online. And he said to the wider cybersecurity world, "Look at this. This is exactly how Conti operates. Here's all the internal details you could possibly need to know to track it down, to neutralize them, to identify the operators, and hopefully deploy some sort of sanctions against them." So bringing it back to the UK sanctions that were announced this week, what we're seeing here is more of an attempt to clamp down on these ransomware criminals and to essentially to target them, to put them personally into the spotlight and say, "We know who you are, we know what you're doing." And the ability to do that, and also I think the Foreign Office has suggested that these guys are taking their direction from the Russian intelligence agency, so they are in fact acting as in my view, in my personal view, you could describe them as acting as a military unit or a paramilitary unit that has its targets selected by the Russian state, by the Russian intelligence agencies themselves. So,
And you can see these parallels again to conventional warfare, talking about paramilitaries. Well, what is a military? It's just taking out functionality of a government, whether it be troops, tanks, buildings, institutions. It's removing that functionality. You could talk of people's lives in terms of functionality, or you can talk about infrastructure in terms of functionality, and that can be information technology infrastructure.
yeah, it's good to be able to sort of bring these criminals into the limelight and say, no longer are you going to hide in the shadows, and no longer are you going to be able to sit there and say, no longer are you going to be able to sit there and say, I'm hiding behind my anonymous internet username and my hard to trace cryptocurrencies. We know your name, we know your age, we've got your mugshots. You're going to be unable to continue operating in the way that you do. And in a very small way, this is actually denting, I suspect, the Russian ability to keep carrying out these cyber attacks. Because ultimately, these people are not members of a formal Russian military unit, these ransomware hackers. They're not people who are within what you might call the protection of the Russian state. They are not completely insulated from the consequences of their actions in a legal way. And it may well be the case that some of them are now sitting there thinking, hell's bells, I'm not as anonymous as I thought I was. They know who I am. If I ever travel abroad outside of Russia again, I may find myself being arrested and extradited to the UK or to the US and facing years or decades in prison as a result. And it's this ability that we have in the West to impose those financial sanctions, to freeze bank accounts, to get hold of overseas assets, to put out port alerts, arrest warrants in place. It's that ability to put that chilling effect on these individuals, which has, and admittedly, it is a small effect. It is a small effect. It's not as immediate as dropping a bomb, or it's not as immediate as a police raid and rounding them all up in one fell swoop. But there is evidence out there to suggest that over time, the impact of these sanctions has slowly degraded these gangs' ability to operate, to recruit new members, and to generally keep on posing the threat that they do to the West and also to Ukraine. And ultimately depriving the Russians of their ready access to these types of online criminals, slowing them down, getting the, if you can put it this way, the best online criminal minds to think, nah, we'll just quietly fade away, thanks very much. That, I think, is a win. That, in my view, is a good positive outcome. It's a small step. It's not a killer blow, as it were, but it is, I think, a good positive development to see that kind of action being taken by the West.
And that gives you some context of what we're talking about here. I'm talking about some groups have split over political allegiances and geopolitics, while others have lost prominent operators, which will impact the way we think about these groups and our traditional understanding of their capabilities. So it's exactly what was talking about there. Goes on to talk about sort of Conti members, some of them being repurposed for actually attacking Ukraine and so on and so forth. But I find that very interesting and not something I've thought an awful lot about, because it really hasn't appeared in the news to the degree I was expecting it to have done. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of understanding of some of the things that's going on there, and how indeed cybersecurity has been affected, or cyber criminality has been affected by things that the UK, US, and other governments are doing to uh, relieve people of their anonymity, to put their details out there and say, right, we know who you are. Be careful about what you do, because your lives could be affected here on in. And I don't know, just lots to think about. It's great to see the kind of this report, and then that reports in Ukraine, the latest, sort of come together and work coherently. I'd advise you go and listen to everything that he actually has to say, Gareth Caulfield, in that. It's from the 10th of February, that particular podcast episode, but well worth listening to. Anyway, I just thought that would be of interest. I'm going to add to that cyber security and cyber crime and cyber, I guess, intelligence work, that part of the video I recorded previously. This is going to add to that in terms of, yes, this is kind of general FSB disinformation spread predominantly online. In fact, this is centering around what I'm going to talk about. Will center around this document that I talked about some time back, and it was this claim of a Ukrainian leaked document showing supposedly something like 35,382 Ukrainian servicemen whom the commander of the armed forces of Ukraine passes off as missing in order not to pay their relatives all this money. So, and that came out I don't even remember, a couple of months back, and it was all kind of big news in terms of pro-Russians shouting, you see, the losses are huge for the Ukrainians, and here's an example of just a number they don't even know. These are supposedly missing Ukrainians, not even a total dead, it's a proportion of the total dead, so on and so forth. Anyway, um, this is an article by Michael Weiss, who writes for Yahoo News, really worth following on Twitter. And he says he's got his hands on an FSB officer's tasking of one of his assets in Novosibirsk to promote a dodgy story suggesting Ukraine was covering up its war dead. There was just one problem. Well, no, there were many, starting with the tasking document being titled Tasks. Okay, so let's have a look at see what he says here. It's really, really worth reading the whole of this. A document obtained by Yahoo News from a Western intelligence agency reveals how Putin's security services rely on local journalists to launder narratives intended to undermine Ukraine's unexpectedly robust performance on the battlefield. The tasking document was given to a Siberia-based Russian journalist by an officer of Russia's Federal Security Services, or FSB, instructing the reporter to circulate claims that Ukraine's Ministry of Defense was intentionally mischaracterizing thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers as, quote, missing in action in order to avoid paying compensation to their families. These claims were said to have come from the hacked email accounts belonging to Serhiy Shaptala, the chief of the Ukrainian Armed Force General Staff. The only problem: the yield of the alleged hack bears obvious signs of manipulation, if not outright invention. So it goes on to say, uh, talking about sort of in general what happens with these kind of disinformation attempts, how you have someone who has their contacts on local levels, and you hit them with a task that you need to put this out on your on your website or in your newspaper or whatever, and then they go and do that, and the kind of pro-Kremlin narrative is spread. And of course, this will be happening on all sides all around the world, this kind of stuff. But anyway, here, the Kremlin's more recent efforts at waging information warfare against Ukraine have often been clumsy, contradictory, or improvisational. For one thing, Moscow. Now, I'm going to add to this. So, for one thing, Moscow originally insisted it launched its invasion to stop neo Nazis in the only country in Europe headed by a Jewish president and with no far right party represented in parliament. When the narrative failed to gain much purchase outside a narrow field of reliably pro Russian politicians and commentators, Moscow flipped the script. Now, top Russian officials say the country is locked in an epic or sacred contest against NATO or Satan, or maybe both. Now, I'm going to add something to that. I wrote an article back in April last year talking about when Russian propaganda goes hilariously wrong. So you have these sorts of um, projects, if you like, that have all the hallmarks of being incorrect, manipulated, and fake, as we'll go on to discuss with regard to that particular document. And here's another example. So it's like, do Russia have form for this? Yes, they do. And this was, I don't even remember, some time back during the invasion of the Russians were taking over houses and whatnot as they're moving through towards Kyiv. And at the time, operatives working in Moscow, or in Russia even, and these pro-Ukrainians. So late on Monday night, the Russian secret services claimed to have foiled an attempt to kill Russian TV propagandist Vladimir Solovyov, who we talk about quite often. They supposedly arrested 6 people in connection with the attempt and released video footage of their finds. Yeah, so this is it. So this is actually in Russia at the time of the invasion, right? So you have all this stuff. And what was really interesting about this, first of all, the Nazi T-shirt still has a fold down the middle. It's like clearly never been worn. This is all like brand new, bought off the internet, like, and odd. Like, why is there a wig there, like a green wig? Anyway, something about this book is particularly interesting because it's got a inscription inside it that makes absolutely no sense and only makes sense if you cocked up. And the other thing is that in this hall, and this is absolutely brilliant, in this hall there were 3 games of Sims, right? So what happened is they had again a kind of task list, right? That someone has said to an FSB agent, you need to go out and buy this stuff. 3 Sims, la 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 la. It's given us lists of stuff, Nazi T-shirt, right? Blah blah blah. Go and get hold of all this stuff. So the lackey goes out and buys all this stuff, except interprets 3 SIM cards as 3 games of Sims. So goes out and buys 3 games of Sims and leaves these around the room, as if look. And then the Russian FSB come in and do this fake raid, except it's not even a raid. They've just got the setup room, and they look at all this stuff that we've taken off the pro-Ukrainian, the people who are going to assassinate Solovyov, and it's like, a brand new set of T-shirts, a brand new unread book, all this paraphernalia because people just leave symbols lying around their room, right? When they're doing a covert operation. If you're doing a covert operation in Russia, you do not have like a Nazi T-shirt. Why? Just why? Why? It's not how it works. Anyway, so this is what Vice means here by clumsy. This is just really really clumsy. But actually, it gets worse than that. So in there, like on their speaker, they've got like a picture of Hitler because that's what you do, and a badge unsewn on, just propped against the speaker. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then when it comes to the book, uh, what? That's it. So, in because that book is worth looking at, it is by well-known Russian neo-Nazis. So the book obviously places these guys as Nazis still. It's like a symbol of their Nazism. And there is an inscription inside the book, which is pretty hilarious. So they've written in it as if to like give it more credibility, except they've basically been really literal in what they've been told to write. So the inscription in the book says um, signature unclear. So it has a bunch of other stuff, and then it says, and then after the stuff it's written, so talking about the book or whatever, it's some kind of like, I'm giving this book to you or whatever, and then it says signature unclear, which is basically the person who's sorted this out has been told to make this inscription and then write an unclear signature afterwards. But they've literally written the words signature unclear. The counter argument against this kind of signature unclear claim, as some pro Russians say, so if you just Google part of the note, you'll see that this is a standard way that the group, this kind of neo Nazi group, signs their posts on Telegram and VK. Obviously, the bust isn't credible and the FSB probably faked it, but the FSB did not write the signature unclear line on the note as a mistake. And then there's a bit of debunking going on of that claim, which is that was only appeared to be a very recent signing the group thing, probably as a result of this cock up, and to try and like cover up the fact that they had signed this thing signature unclear. So the interesting part is, as I said in the article, that as others have claimed in reply to this tweet, the supposed signing off of this group may only be a recent thing, as in created by the FSB after this find in order to justify their bungle in light of the mockery. The internet caches, however, might not support the claim, and what is definitely clear is that this would be an online forum thing only, and very unlikely to be written by hand as a sign off in a pristine book that looks like it has never been read. And here's, in fact, the signature there. So it's like you've got this pristine book that's never been read. So it's obviously not that important as a thing, unless it's just a symbol. But then why would you carry a symbol of your Nazism around with you for a covert secret operation in Russia that's very dangerous? And if you got caught with all this stuff, you've got extra evidence to why you are wrongdoers. And then, and then sign that signature unknown. Um, and all this kind of distribution of this stuff is just completely bonkers. Anyway, that article I wrote just to show how ridiculous that was as an instance, and then you piece that together with these kind of projects here. So to continue the Weiss argument article, the FSB document on the supposed Ukrainian hack, uncreatively titled Zadania tasks, was sent to Yuri Karnovsky, a 63-year-old journalist and editor living in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, more than 2,000 miles from Russia's border with Ukraine. The sender was Alexander Yatsura, an employee of the FBS's Novosibirsk branch, formerly the head of press office of the FSB border service in that region in 2010 and 2011. It goes on to talk about other details about those people. But talking about Karnovsky, so this is a guy who was like a local internet journalist type thing, um, who was sent this stuff of Karnovsky. Since at least 2010, Karnovsky has run his own website called World and We. Its strapline is Truth and Objectivity, published in 4 languages: Russian, English, Polish, and Ukrainian. This little known portal may be said to fall short of its lofty mission statement, truth and objectivity. So it's basically this website for massive Russian narrative disinformation. And this fits in with kind of the internal narratives that the Google report was talking about. But anyway, in early January, Yatsura sent Karnovsky an order, the Western Intel shows. Quote, draft an article based on the materials published in the highly rated Telegram channel, The World Today with Yuri Podolyak, which is itself like just conspiracy theories and disinformation, about the hacking by the Antichrist combatant group of the archives of the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, S. Shaptala, and the discovery of official correspondence confirming the death of 35,382 Ukrainian servicemen whom the Commander of the Armed Forces of Ukraine passes off as missing in order not to pay their relatives the 15 million hryvnia, $400,000 prescribed by law. Among the main theses that Yatsura tells Karnovsky to hammer home at World and We is that Zelensky's government is, quote, controlled by Washington, and it falsely categorizes over thousands of Ukrainian military personnel as missing rather than deceased in order to deprive them of monetary compensation, benefits, and other social payments promised by V. Zelensky. Furthermore, Zelensky should be presented, Yatsura writes, as prioritizing foreign mercenaries and nationalists from the Azov regiment in the lists for prisoner exchanges. And this is all about like giving this narrative of Azov being Nazis, of foreign mercenaries. You can see that this is just the construction, a very explicit set of tasks for someone way further down the list of importance. Some just guy running this website in Novosibirsk, being tasked with doing this, being part of this disinformation, project that has global reach. And the FSB email. I mean, there's lots more details here. You can read the article itself. But the FSB email ends on a note of exhorting Karnovsky, himself of Ukrainian birth, to address the nation targeted by Putin's invasion as follows. Citizen of Ukraine, remember, your death is not needed by your family and homeland. Biden and Zelensky need your death. So then, it's like, this is how you should write it. This is how you should end the article. There, go for it. And then it sort of talks about where this particular letter came from, where the hack originally originated, and how it's just like copied and thrown out by all these different sources, including World and We, under the orders of this Yatsura, this FSB agent, telling this guy to here's a letter, here's what you want to say. But then when you look at the letter itself, and there was lots of claims at the time that this was fake. But a couple of nuggets just to throw in there. The document has clear signs of fabrication. A section in the upper right-hand corner contains an isolated and broken fragment of recurring text, Ukrainian words indicating the document is, quote, top secret, as if copied and pasted there by mistake. So you've got some, not good bit of copy and pasting, some errors that you probably wouldn't see on such an official document that follows a sort of pro forma guise. An officer in the GUR, so Ukraine's military intelligence service, who asked to remain anonymous, told Yahoo News that the document is a forgery and that Shaptala's communications had never been hacked. Quote, top secret documents are not sent via the data exchange system, the GUR officer said. By form, it's close to the requirements, but not the same. For instance, paper documents are always signed by an official or signed digitally when sent via the data exchange system. This one isn't signed at all. Also, the stamp in the upper left-hand corner should contain a specific place for the date and number of the document. That's missing here. In short, it's a clear fake. So there are a couple of indications on this that it's just a fake document. But World and We, so Karnofsky, did publish an article corresponding with the FSB's instructions on January the 12th, 2023. It reused the MASH screenshots, so those screenshots you just seen, of the purportedly hacked documents from Shaptala's accounts, but conjoined this story with two other narratives. The first was about protests across Ukraine demanding explanations for missing soldiers. There were some protests about this, but it's kind of like using that to fuel and to pad out this narrative. In the towns, quote, in the towns and villages of Ukraine, there have already been regular protests from families of servicemen who, quote, disappeared without a trace during battles with the Russian occupiers, the piece stated. And it sort of does do that. And it goes on to show how the piece is just basically, typical kind of disinformation fare from the Russians here. The World and We article is credited to someone named Stephen Bulbenko, who is also listed as the author of anti-Ukrainian or anti-NATO articles on numerous other minor pro-Kremlin propaganda sites and spreading conspiracy theories and disinformation, blah, blah, blah. In other words, this is all it just fits in the whole remit of this being, FSB. It's the remit of the FSB, and it's clearly disinformation. So, quote, units for disseminating disinformation or propaganda are in every Russian region, and they all have their own collaborators, like Karnofsky, the Western intelligence source said. Their objective is to pollute an information ecosystem with so many unverified and contentious claims that truth becomes all but impossible to separate from fiction. And debunking lies requires far more time and energy than the ready manufacture of more of them. This is really important. This is called Brandolini's Law, this last one. I've written on Brandolini's Law a bunch of times because it infuriates me. Brandolini's Law is a bullshit asymmetry, which is that it takes far less energy to spread BS than it does to unpick it and show that it's not true. If someone presents me with an argument and says, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong, and gives me like 3 lines, I then have to go and find all the evidence and supporting arguments to properly debunk those 3 lines. And it takes me 3 hours to prepare something that someone else has thrown down in like 1 minute of, this is the case with disinformation. It is so there's been research to show that, say, on Facebook and other social media, fake news spreads 5 times quicker than truth. And so it spreads quicker. People, because it's like, oh my goodness, look at this, read this, check this out. And it spreads and spreads and fits in with like polarized thought processes and ideologies. Disinformation like that spreads really quickly, but then to unpick it takes a huge amount of time and effort. And generally, that kind of unpicking is not spread as widely as the false claims in the first place. It's a really difficult business trying to undo these disinformation, and that's why people like Google getting involved in this kind of cyber in these information operations in this area is super important. You need the big clout of these corporations that can use algorithms to kind of find and get rid of disinformation. It's just because it's going back to like, but it's freedom of speech. You shouldn't regulate against stuff like this. is the assumption that humans are A, all rational, and B, have the full access to all the knowledge and information that they should do and would like to. And actually, even if they have access to that, can be bothered to read it and even want to know. So this is why freedom of speech is as this like wonderful ideal is actually fraught with problem. Like the whole idea is a bit of a broken philosophical concept because it's not like pure freedom of speech. I've spoken about this lots before. No one advocates for that really because you wouldn't want your child watching pornography, like your 8-year-old child having to watch, turning on TV at lunchtime and there being pornography on there. Oh no, that's freedom of speech, right? We can say what we like or show what we like. No, okay, well, so we need to regulate against that. So there's no swearing before the watershed. There's no inappropriate stuff. I mean, so on and so forth. So you do have to regulate freedom of speech. So, but here this is where it gets dangerous. So yeah, they have the right to say what they like. So the Russian government has the right to say what they like, which is spreading lies and that falling on vulnerable people or people not willing to search for the truth, and then them sucking that up and that becoming tangibly dangerous. Okay, and if that is a case, then you need to fight back against that. It's no good just saying, well, people should just be free to read and listen to what they want, and they can make up their own decisions. Yeah, but they end up making bad decisions based on terrible disinformation that is manipulating them and their thoughts. So this is really difficult, but there has to be work done to 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 disincentivize disinformation sharing. There has to be work done to fight against those narratives, those false narratives that are being spread by Russia. In this case, Russia. Um, how far you take that into society, and whether this goes into domestic politics hugely, and whether this, you're talking about science. Yeah, these are all big discussions, right? That's not for here, but I am advocating, the work of people like Google here, but I'm advocating that something has to be done in a very tangible way to stop Russia spreading outright lies that can have a meaningful negative effect on the war in Ukraine. And in fact, has it is dangerous because people's lives are lost, possibly, probably, certainly on the back of that misinformation, disinformation. When you've got public support for Russia in the war, and that public support is fueling the war effort, and that public support is based on disinformation, you can see where the issues are. Anyway, lots to think about. You can check out my article on Only Sky when Russian propaganda goes hilariously wrong. This kind of stuff happens all the time. Um, uh, I will have another extra video to talk about other things, but this was just concentrating on cyber and a little bit of you know the information space. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.